Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Adrian Panda, business and immigration attorney, and today we're going to talk about converting your E-2 visa to an EB-5 green card. So this is a question I encounter all the time during consultations, speaking to clients, and it's, look, we love the E-2 visa. It opens up the US, business is growing, but we are considering permanently residing in the US. So can we somehow convert this E-2 visa to an EB-5 green card? Now, before I dive deeper into this video and how to actually convert your E-2 to an EB-5, I have a separate video on all the other permanent residence options. So the bottom line is, this is one way of obtaining permanent residence from an E-2 visa, but there's other options as well. So just make sure, you also explore those. And like I said, I have a separate video on that subject that you can find in the description below. Before we jump into this topic any further, let's look at the EB-5 requirements first. So EB-5, its name even says it, it's an investor green card, right? Investor permanent residence. So first and foremost, it requires an investment. That investment, unlike in the E-2, has a specific amount, and it's $1,050,000 as of the date of recording of this video in March of 2025. So in addition to that, some businesses that are located in specific areas, they're called targeted employment areas, qualify for a lower investment amount of $800,000. In addition to these substantial capital investment requirements, the EB-5 process also requires the creation of 10 full-time jobs. So in order to qualify for EB-5, you must have created 10 full-time jobs, or more accurately, the commercial enterprise, the US business, must have created 10 full-time jobs. Now, before I go any further, there's an important aspect of the EB-5 process that I also want to explain, because the EB-5 process has two separate petitions and two separate stages. There's the I-526, which is the initial petition in which you're showing that you're in the process of investing the funds or have already invested the funds, and you submit a business plan explaining how the 10 jobs will be created. Once that's approved, you can qualify for what's called a conditional green card, conditional permanent residence, for 2 years. And before the end of that 2-year period, you have to file an I-829, I-829 petition in which you actually show that these 10 jobs were in fact created. So now that we've gone over the basics, let's dive into all of these criteria in a little bit more detail. So first, let's start with the investment amount, right? Unlike the E-2, the EB-5 has a specific investment amount, and it's a large figure, right? $1,050,000 or $800,000. Now, many E-2 businesses do not get started with this level of capital injection. So the first question that I tell all my clients to consider is, hey, does your particular E-2 business require this kind of capital, right? Some businesses do, right? Anything that involves physical space, manufacturing, anything that, especially real estate heavy businesses, do require capital injections, or any businesses that require the hiring of many employees, etc. But many don't, right? So if you come to the determination that, hey, it doesn't make business sense for us to inject all this capital into the business, don't forget that you could start another business on for the EB-5 project, right? So I've had clients do an E-2 for one of the spouses, let's say a couple, and then the other spouse that has free employment authorization in the US as an E-2 dependent spouse goes and opens a separate business that is much more cash intensive or requires much more cash, and that business is then in fact used for the EB-5. So this is just a great place to plan. But the bottom line is, right, unlike the E-2, the EB-5 process requires a significant cash commitment, significant cash capitalization. So the bottom line is, make sure you have a plan, right? What that money will be used for and how it can benefit the business. If it can't benefit the E-2 business, consider another business. Just make sure that whoever's working in that business has the relevant work authorization, because the E-2 principal investor can only work for the E-2 enterprise. The second requirement that needs to be considered is this job creation requirement. 10 full-time jobs. It's a big requirement, and I want to go, before I give you some planning considerations here, I want to go through what counts as a full-time job for EB-5 purposes, right? So E-2 principal investor, right? The main applicant for EB-5, right? The main investor does not count. The investor's spouse and children do not count. And also anyone on a non-immigrant visa, so any F1 students, H1Bs, O1s, whatever it may be, that are working for the business do not count as well. And also any prior employees that were part of the business before the E-2 visa, or were not created based on that E-2 investment, also do not count, right? So to count those prior employees, you have to show that that initial E-2 investment is what actually created those jobs. So the bottom line is, it's very restrictive on who counts for EB-5 purposes as a full-time employee. And also keep in mind that 10 full-time employees is a lot. So what I see with a lot of E-2 businesses, unless the E-2 project was sizable to start with, converting a smaller scale business to make it qualify for EB-5 is generally harder, not so much because of the capital investment requirement. I see clients have a bigger issue with this employment requirement, or the hiring of the 10 full-time employees, simply because a lot of E-2s are started as smaller businesses, startups that just don't require this many employees. And generally speaking, the E-2s that start companies that require this many employees from the get-go are already planning or are already considering the EB-5 process as part of their application as a future potential option, right? Now, one thing you may read about, right, is that if your business is a troubled business, then you will not have to create 10 new jobs. Now, this is true, and basically the troubled business is one that in the last, basically you look at, it has to have been in existence for at least 2 years, and in those 2 years, it must have employed at least 10 people and must have had losses of at least 20% of the business's total value. USCIS calls it the business's net worth. If you qualify under this, so basically think of it as you purchased a business that had significant losses, 20% of net worth, and employs 10 people, then you do not have to actually go ahead and create 10 new jobs. To be really honest with you, if you find yourself in the weeds of looking at these exceptions to the rule, I would advise you to talk to someone experienced in these topics, simply because it's very nuanced. And what I see is, in practice, investors generally, foreign investors, I should say, do not buy troubled businesses as often as they buy successful businesses, because they make the whole visa application process easier. But it's something that you should know, right? That if you are purchasing a troubled business, you may be exempt from this requirement. In addition to that, with the job requirement, the creation of jobs, you should also keep in mind that you may need a buffer, right? So a lot of people are so focused on this number 10, but then what if something changes? What if you can't create a job last minute? Don't forget that you basically have that 2-year period to prove to the government that you've created these 10 jobs. So even though the rule says 10, I tell everyone that you should plan for more to leave yourself a bit of a buffer, right? And then in addition to all this, you may be reading about, what kind of jobs qualify, and if it's a regional center, certain jobs will also qualify that are actually not directly created jobs on payroll. That is true in the regional center context, but in those cases, just to differentiate it from what I'm talking about here, regional center EB-5s are completely different from converting your E-2 business to an EB-5 business. Basically, that's when you're on an E-2, you have earned money, and you apply for EB-5 through a regional center where you give your money to a regional center investment and you're actually not involved in the business itself. It's the regional center. I'm not going to focus on that in this video. This video focuses on if you want to take your successful E2 business and see if you can make it qualify for EB-5. But just know that that's a separate scenario, and in that scenario, indirect job creation could also come into play. To summarize all of this, right? Basically, in order to convert your E2 to EB-5, you have to invest significant cash, $1,050,000 or $800,000 if in a targeted employment area. And most importantly, perhaps, or perhaps more difficultly, you have to actually create 10 full-time jobs. This is absolutely critical. Now, a couple of other considerations in addition to these that I want you to keep in mind. Once you become a permanent resident, right, you actually have a residency requirement. So the rule is more complicated than what I'm about to say, but the easiest way to think about this is, as a U.S. permanent resident, you should spend at least half the year inside the U.S. The E-2 does not have this requirement. You can live abroad for the majority of the year and use the E2 when you're in the US directing and developing that business in the US. So make sure before you consider any EB-5 or permanent residence strategies that you actually want to reside the majority of the year in the US. Now, like I said, there's exceptions to all of this, but generally speaking, it's a critical requirement for permanent residents, and this is why the E2 in a lot of cases works better than EB-5 or permanent residence. In addition to this, and this is perhaps the most important planning consideration, the moment you become a permanent resident, you become a tax resident under the tax code. And what that means is that your worldwide income is subject to US income taxes. While with the E2, if you are not in the US to satisfy the substantial presence test, so basically you spend the majority of the year outside the country, or under the E2, you could also invoke basically the closer connection exception under a tax treaty, in which even though you're in the US a lot, you claim a closer connection to the foreign tax treaty country. In these cases, you will not subject your worldwide income to US income taxes, right? Now, this can become absolutely critical from a tax planning perspective. So just keep in mind that a lot of people rush into I need to get EB-5, I need to get EB-5, or become a permanent resident. Yes, it's a great option for many, but just know that you will have to reside here and you will become a US tax resident. So make sure you're planning ahead before you jump into anything too hastily. In addition to all of this that I mentioned, right? My general takeaway with converting E2s to EB-5s is that very often what I see, and this is just more practical advice, right, is that businesses that qualify, that are good EB-5 candidates, right, from the get-go, are often created by individuals who own businesses abroad. So I very rarely see someone who has never managed a larger company all of a sudden move to the US and want to employ 10 people. And the individuals who have this experience, right, where they're managing bigger companies or own, significant percentages in bigger companies outside the US, they can potentially qualify for the EB-1, a multinational manager category. This is why we use that one much more frequently than EB-5. While what I see with a lot of E2 businesses that are not of this scale is that they're better suited for smaller businesses with less employees. And in those cases, I find that rather than taking a successful E2 business that's making you money and has been a success story, often creating a different company with a different business plan for the EB-5 makes a lot more sense, because often the E2 business does not require those employees, even though generally most businesses can use the cash, but it's the employees that it doesn't require. While then if you create a new enterprise, a new business for the EB-5, well then you can use the funds and everything in there and can create a different path that actually requires those employees. So I want to say I relatively rarely see the conversion of an E2 business to EB-5. I often see E2 visa holders then pursue EB-5. That makes sense generally through another business or through a regional center. Now, one more thing I wanted to mention that is critical before I end this video, and that's the source of funds. For the E-2, you have to demonstrate source of funds, but for EB-5, the analysis is much stricter. So you actually have to trace back each and every dollar to its origin, and USCIS is going to look through that carefully and make sure that the entire investment is accounted for. Now, the one question I get all the time is, can I use the money I earn from my E-2 business to qualify for EB-5? And the answer is yes, right? You can generally use the initial investment as long as you explain it well in the business plan, as well as any income you derived from the business that you then, reinvested into the business for EB-5 purposes. But, and this is an important but, in order for that income derived from the E-2 business to count for EB-5 purposes, you have to have actually realized it as call it a distribution, a draw, a dividend, depending on how your company is structured, and have to have had paid taxes on it. So basically, think of it this way. Say your E-2 business is structured as a corporation. The corporation issues you a dividend. You pay income taxes on that said dividend, and then you use it to reinvest for EB-5 purposes. That counts. But if the money just sits inside the corporation and you never actually realize it as personal income, and there's no income taxes paid on that, then it will not count fully for as part of to satisfy the investment criteria for EB-5. The bottom line and your number one takeaway from this video should be that it's doable. It's definitely doable. You can go from E-2 to EB-5. You can even use the same business, but it requires very careful planning. You need to make sure that on the business side, everything is organized neatly, operationally, as well as on the financial side to satisfy the investment requirement. You also need to plan ahead and have a plan on how you can document the 10 jobs. And then not least, you have to make sure that this will not upset any tax strategies or any tax planning you have done. So again, fully doable, just requires very careful planning in advance. This is one of those categories where I would tell most people to work with an experienced professional, just because there's a lot of places where mistakes can really jeopardize these cases. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please like the video. If you like the content, please follow the channel and I'll continue to post more of these. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.